On a crisp October evening in 2023, while Seattle's Pike Place market hummed with the scent of fresh coffee and autumn rain tapped against the windows of my small apartment, my carefully constructed life of 5 years crumbled in the span of 30 minutes during what was supposed to be a routine family meeting about my father's estate. I had just returned from my evening shift at the VA Counseling Center, my navy pea coat still damp from the Pacific Northwest drizzle. The familiar weight of exhaustion settled into my shoulders, the kind that comes from spending 8 hours helping fellow veterans navigate their trauma while carefully hiding the fact that I could buy the entire building if I wanted to. My worn combat boots sat by the door, scuffed leather telling stories I never shared with my family. Stories of deployments, of decisions made in desert heat that led to opportunities they couldn't fathom, of a military contractor buyout that had quietly made me wealthier than any of them could imagine. The Zoom call notification blinked insistently on my laptop screen. Henderson Family Estate Meeting, it read, hosted by my younger brother Marcus from his pristine home office in Bellevue. I positioned myself carefully in front of my deliberately modest bookshelf, the one lined with secondhand paperbacks and a single framed photo of my unit from Afghanistan. Everything in the frame spoke of someone just getting by, someone who needed help rather than someone who had been secretly funding half the family's lifestyle for years. Marcus appeared first, his designer glasses catching the light from his expensive ring light setup. Then came my sister Rachel from her converted garage studio, paint-stained apron still tied around her waist, looking perpetually frazzled as always. Mom joined from the kitchen of the house I had quietly helped save from foreclosure 3 years ago, her graying hair pulled back in the same tired ponytail she'd worn since Dad's diagnosis. "Sarah, you look thin," Mom said immediately, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and judgment I'd grown accustomed to. "Are you eating enough? I worry about you in that tiny place." I nodded, sipping from my chipped ceramic mug, filled with store-brand coffee, while mentally calculating that the tiny place she referenced had cost me more in monthly rent than most people made in salary. The irony wasn't lost on me that I chose to live modestly while they assumed I lived cheaply out of necessity. Marcus cleared his throat, shuffling papers importantly. "So, we need to discuss Dad's final medical bills and the estate distribution. Obviously, we're all going to need to contribute what we can." His eyes found mine through the screen. "Sarah, I know your situation isn't ideal working at the VA and all, so we're not expecting much from you. Maybe whatever you can spare from your disability checks." The words hit like shrapnel. Disability checks, as if my service had broken me into someone who needed their charity, rather than someone who had used military discipline and strategic thinking to build something they couldn't comprehend. I said nothing, just nodded slowly while my jaw tightened. Rachel chimed in, her voice taking on that overly gentle tone people use when they think you're fragile. "We were thinking maybe 500 if you can manage it. I know it's a lot on your income, but Marcus and I are already stretching ourselves thin." She gestured vaguely at her art supplies, her struggling artist narrative conveniently ignoring the fact that I had been the anonymous buyer of her last 6 paintings, paying triple the asking price through a third-party gallery. The laptop screen flickered slightly, casting shadows across their concerned faces. Concerned about my imaginary poverty. Concerned about my supposed limitations. Never once considering that the quiet sister who served 2 tours in Afghanistan might have learned something about resilience, about opportunity, about building wealth in ways they never thought to explore. "The lawyer wants to meet with all of us next week," Mom continued. "He says there are some final papers to sign, something about the trust Dad set up. Apparently, there's more complexity to the estate than we realized." My pulse quickened. The lawyer, Dad's estate attorney, James Morrison, from Morrison and Associates, the same firm that had handled my investment portfolio for the past 3 years. The same man who knew exactly who Sarah Henderson really was behind the carefully maintained facade of financial struggle. I managed to keep my voice steady. "What kind of complexity?" Marcus waved dismissively, Probably just legal paperwork. Dad was always secretive about money. You know how he was. He paused, then added with what he probably thought was kindness. Don't worry about it, Sarah. The complicated stuff is for people who understand investments and business. We'll handle the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting. If only he knew that. While he was getting his MBA and complaining about student loans, I was using my GI Bill benefits to study finance and economics, then leveraging my military contacts into opportunities he'd never dreamed of. If only he knew that the portfolio I'd built could buy his house, his car, and his entire lifestyle without making a dent in my net worth. I'll be there, I said simply. The meeting ended with the usual pleasantries, the usual assumptions, the usual careful dance around my supposed financial inadequacy. I closed the laptop and sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, rain continuing its steady rhythm against the windows. Across the room, my secure phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, the one my investment manager used to call with updates on acquisitions and returns, the one my family had never seen. In 5 days, I would sit in that law office while James Morrison reviewed Dad's estate. In 5 days, the carefully constructed narrative of Sarah Henderson, struggling veteran, would collide with the reality of Sarah Henderson, silent investor and hidden benefactor to the very family who pitied her. I sat motionless for nearly an hour after the call ended, the weight of their words settling into my chest like concrete. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing closer as their assumptions echoed in the silence. $500. That's what they thought I could contribute to Dad's final expenses. $500 from my disability checks, the irony burned like acid in my throat. Last month alone, I had quietly transferred $12,000 to cover Marcus's mortgage payment when his startup consulting firm hit another rough patch. He never knew where that mysterious processing error at the bank came from, the one that gave him an extra month to make his payment. Rachel's art studio rent? The anonymous benefactor who had been covering it for 18 months was sitting right here, wearing secondhand jeans and drinking dollar store coffee. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my phone, not the secure but my regular device that my family knew about. The cracked screen protector caught the lamplight as I scrolled through our family group chat, rereading messages from the past year. Marcus complaining about his financial stress while posting photos of his new Tesla. Rachel lamenting her poverty while showcasing her latest gallery opening. Mom worrying about making ends meet while living in the house I had kept from foreclosure. Each message was a small betrayal, not because they shared their struggles, but because they had constructed an entire narrative about my place in the family. Hierarchy. I was the cautionary tale, the one who had served her country and come home damaged, struggling, dependent. The one who needed their patience and understanding because, clearly, I hadn't figured out how to be successful like they had. I stood abruptly, pacing to the kitchen where my reflection caught in the black window. 42 years old, graying, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same flannel shirt I'd owned for 6 years. Everything about my appearance supported their story. I had crafted this image so carefully, so thoroughly, that even I sometimes forgot it was a mask. The secure phone buzzed once from the counter. A text from Elena Rodriguez, my investment manager at Pacific Asset Management. Q3 returns exceeded projections by 15%. Portfolio now valued at 47.3. Recommend diversifying into emerging markets. Call when convenient. $47.3 million. While my brother worried about his mortgage and my sister scraped by selling paintings, I controlled enough wealth to change their lives permanently. Yet they saw me as the family member who needed charity, who required their concerned glances and gentle suggestions about finding more stable work. The rain had intensified against the windows, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights beyond. I thought about Dad, about the last conversation we'd had before his final hospitalization. He had gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "You're stronger than any of them know, Sarah. Don't let them make you smaller." At the time, I thought he was talking about my recovery from service, about building confidence after trauma. Now I wondered if he had seen through my careful facade. My laptop sat closed on the small dining table, still warm from the video call that had shifted something fundamental inside me. For 5 years, I had maintained this elaborate performance, this careful balance of appearing grateful for their concern while secretly ensuring their stability. I had told myself it was protection, that revealing my success would change our relationships in ways I couldn't predict or control. But tonight, listening to Marcus dismiss my potential contribution with such casual condescension, watching Rachel nod along as if my supposed poverty was simply a fact they all accepted, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, exactly, but something deeper. The part of me that had believed this arrangement was sustainable, maybe even kind. The meeting with the lawyer loomed like a storm on the horizon. James Morrison knew exactly who I was, had handled my investments with the discretion I paid for, had never once questioned why I insisted on complete anonymity in all my dealings. But in 5 days, we would all be sitting in the same room, and the careful walls I had built between my two lives were about to crumble. The next morning brought the kind of gray Seattle dawn that seemed to seep into your bones, and with it, a clarity I hadn't expected. As I sat at my kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, still in my old Army PT shirt and worn pajama pants, I found myself opening a mental filing cabinet I had kept locked for years. The patterns were all there, clear as daylight once I stopped, avoiding them. It hadn't started with money. It had started the day I came home from my second deployment in 2018, carrying invisible wounds and a determination to never be a burden to anyone. I remember walking into Mom's kitchen, thinner than when I'd left, hyper-vigilant from months of scanning for IEDs, and hearing Rachel whisper to Marcus in the living room, "She looks broken. Do you think she'll be able to work?" Broken. The word had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest and never left. Within a week, I had found the small apartment near the VA, taken the counseling job, and begun the careful construction of Sarah Henderson, version 2.0. The one who was managing just fine, thank you very much, but who clearly wasn't thriving the way her siblings were. Marcus had graduated with his MBA while I was overseas. He'd started his consulting firm with money from Dad's retirement fund, a gift that was presented as an investment in the family's future. When I returned, shell-shocked and readjusting, there had been no offers of startup capital for me. Instead, there were gentle suggestions about taking time to heal and not rushing into anything too ambitious. The first time I helped them financially, it was Rachel. She had called me crying about eviction notices and unpaid bills, her art career stumbling through another rough patch. I had just received my first major return from a defense contractor investment, money that had grown from a modest military pension rollover into something substantial. Without thinking, I had transferred $3,000 to her account. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver," she had sobbed through the phone. "I don't know how I'll ever pay you back on your salary, but I promise I will." I had never asked for it back, and she had never offered again. The pattern crystallized as I remembered sitting in that same chair 2 years ago, watching Marcus pace around Mom's living room during Thanksgiving dinner. His consulting firm was hemorrhaging money, he explained, gesturing dramatically with his wine glass. The Tesla payments were killing him. The house in Bellevue was stretching him thin. His wife wanted another baby, but they couldn't afford childcare for the one they had. "I just don't understand how some people make it look so easy," he had said, flopping onto the couch with theatrical exhaustion. "Look at Johnson down the street. Guy started with nothing. Now he's got 3 rental properties and sends his kids to private school." I had said nothing, had simply nodded sympathetically while mentally calculating how much of Johnson's success actually came from my investment in his real estate development company. Marcus never knew that his mysterious, delayed client payment that arrived just in time to save his business was actually me, routing money through carefully layered corporate structures to preserve both his pride and my anonymity. Mom had patted his shoulder that day, then looked at me with those eyes full of gentle pity. "At least you don't have those kinds of pressures, honey. Sometimes I think there's something to be said for living simply. Living simply." As if my choice to drive a 10-year-old Honda instead of a luxury car was evidence of limited options rather than deliberate discretion. As if my small apartment was all I could afford rather than a conscious decision to avoid attention. The memories flooded back now, each one adding weight to the growing pile of evidence. The family dinners where they discussed their problems while carefully steering conversation away from my work, as if talking about the VA would make everyone uncomfortable. The birthday gifts that were always practical, gift cards to grocery. Stores, warm socks, a coffee maker because yours looks like it's seen better days. Christmas 2 years ago had been particularly telling. Rachel had given Marcus an expensive camera for his creative projects, complete with professional lighting, equipment. Marcus had gifted Rachel a month-long artist residency in Portland, fully paid. For me, they had pooled their resources to buy a heated blanket and a gift certificate for meal delivery, along with a card that read, "Because you deserve to treat yourself sometimes. Treat yourself." The phrase had stung more than I wanted to admit. They saw my life as something that needed small luxuries because it lacked larger ones. They saw me as someone who couldn't afford to treat herself, who needed their collective charity to experience even minor indulgences. I got up from the table and walked to my bedroom closet, pushing aside the carefully curated collection of modest clothing to reveal a small safe hidden behind a false wall I'd installed myself. Inside were documents that told a different story entirely. Bank statements showing consistent 7-figure balances. Investment portfolios spanning dozens of companies, many of which my family discussed admiringly without knowing I owned significant stakes in them. Property deeds for rental units across 3 states. Corporate filings showing my ownership in the very asset management firm that Marcus had once mentioned wishing he could afford to hire. The irony was suffocating. They saw me as the cautionary tale, the family member who proved that military service could leave you functional but not successful. They used me as a yardstick for their own achievements, a reminder that at least they had figured out how to build something meaningful with their lives. Marcus had said it explicitly during Rachel's gallery opening last spring, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who thought he was being encouraging. "Look at Sarah," he had told a group of Rachel's artist friends, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt more proprietary than affectionate. "She served our country, came home, and found meaningful work helping other veterans, not everyone needs to chase money to have a successful life." The artist friends had nodded approvingly, their eyes soft with the kind of respect people give to someone they see as noble but limited. Someone who had chosen purpose over profit because profit wasn't really an option. They had no way of knowing that the gallery space itself was owned by a subsidiary of my investment company, or that the mysterious donor who had sponsored the community art program Rachel now taught was the same person they were looking at with such gentle condescension. I pulled out one particular document, a corporate filing from 3 years ago when I had quietly purchased the building that housed Marcus's consulting firm. His landlord had been planning to sell to a developer who wanted to convert the space to condos. Marcus had been panicking about finding new office space, about the disruption to his business, about the impossibility of finding something affordable. In Seattle's commercial real estate market, the solution had been elegant in its simplicity. I purchased the building through a shell company, hired a property management firm to handle day-to-day operations, and instructed them to offer existing tenants favorable long-term leases. Marcus had been ecstatic about his incredible luck in securing a 10-year lease at below-market rates from his understanding new landlord. He had never questioned his good fortune. None of them ever questioned the convenient timing of their windfalls, the mysterious benefactors, the lucky breaks that seemed to appear just when they needed them most. They were too busy managing their own narratives of struggle and success to notice the invisible hand that kept smoothing their paths. But the pattern wasn't just about money. It was about visibility, about value, about the stories families tell themselves about who matters and how much. At Dad's 70th birthday party, the toast had been telling. Marcus had spoken eloquently about Dad's business acumen, his ability to provide for the family, his example of American entrepreneurship. Rachel had shared a touching story about Dad's support for her artistic dreams, his belief that creativity was as valuable as any traditional career. When it was my turn, the room had gone quiet in that particular way that suggested people were being polite rather than interested. I had kept it brief, thanking Dad for his support during my military service, and his understanding when I came home changed. The applause had been warm but perfunctory, the kind you give when someone has said something appropriate rather than meaningful. Later that evening, I had overheard Rachel talking to our cousin Jennifer in the kitchen. "Sarah's doing so much better than we expected," she had said, her voice carrying relief rather than pride. "When she first came back, we weren't sure she'd be able to hold down a steady job. The VA work seems good for her. Not too demanding, you know? Not too demanding." As if helping veterans navigate their trauma, process their benefits, and rebuild their lives was somehow less challenging than Marcus's consulting work or Rachel's art. As if the choice to work in public service indicated an inability to handle more complex challenges rather than a commitment to something larger than personal gain. The sun had finally broken through the Seattle clouds, casting slanted light across my kitchen table where years of financial documents told the real story of our family's stability. Every crisis averted, every opportunity seized, every safety net that had appeared at just the right moment. All of it traced back to this apartment, to this carefully hidden life I had built while they constructed their own narratives of struggle and success. In 3 days, James Morrison would sit across from all of us in his law office, and the careful architecture of deception I had built would face its greatest test. The question that had kept me awake since the family meeting wasn't whether my secret would be revealed. That seemed increasingly inevitable. The question was, what would happen when the people who had spent 5 years seeing me as their cautionary tale discovered I was actually their guardian angel? The origins of this elaborate deception traced back to a conversation I'd had with Dad. 6 months before his death, though I didn't understand its significance at the time, we were sitting on his back porch, watching the Seattle skyline disappear into evening fog, when he suddenly asked me why I lived the way I did. "What do you mean?" I had asked, genuinely confused. He gestured vaguely toward my Honda parked in his driveway, then at my thrift store jacket hanging on his porch chair. "You were always the smartest one, Sarah, even as a kid. Your math teacher called you gifted. Your high school counselor said you could get into any college you wanted. The military gave you discipline, structure, connections. So why do you live like you're afraid of success?" I had deflected, made some comment about preferring simplicity, but his question had lodged itself in my mind like shrapnel. The truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit, even to myself. The deception hadn't started as a plan. It had evolved from a wound that had never properly healed. Growing up, I had been the responsible one by default. Mom worked double shifts at the hospital, Dad ran his small accounting firm, and someone needed to manage the household. I was 8 when I started doing laundry for the family, 10 when I began cooking dinner most nights, 12 when I took over helping Marcus and Rachel with their homework while managing my own accelerated coursework. The pattern was established early. Sarah handles things. Sarah doesn't need attention. Sarah figures it out on her own. Marcus was the charming one, the one who could talk his way out of trouble and into opportunities. Even as a toddler, he had this magnetic quality that drew adults to him. Teachers loved him, coaches favored him, family friends remembered his name at gatherings while I faded into the background. When he struggled with math in middle school, Dad hired a tutor. When I struggled with the social dynamics of being 2 years younger than my classmates due to academic acceleration, I was told to toughen up. Rachel was the creative one, the dreamer who painted watercolor masterpieces at age 7 and wrote poetry that made Mom cry. Her art supplies were always prioritized in the family budget. Her bedroom was converted into a studio when she turned 15. Her college applications to art schools were celebrated as following her passion, while my acceptance to West Point was treated as a practical choice for someone who needed structure. The military had been my escape, my chance to prove myself in an environment that valued competence over charisma. But even there, I had learned to be useful rather than visible. I became the soldier who volunteered for the difficult assignments, who stayed late to help struggling teammates, who never complained about deployments or dangerous postings. My commanders appreciated my reliability, but their commendations always carried the same subtle message. Sarah gets things done without fanfare. When I returned from my second deployment in Afghanistan, carrying both invisible wounds and hard-earned wisdom about opportunity, I had made a conscious decision to disappear into competence once again. The VA job was perfect cover, meaningful work that explained my modest lifestyle while providing the flexibility I needed to pursue other interests. Those other interests had started small. A conversation with a fellow veteran at the VA had led to learning about defense contractor stocks. My military connections provided insight into which companies were likely to secure major contracts. My accounting background, learned by necessity during those years of managing household finances, helped me understand corporate structures and investment strategies. The first significant return had been almost accidental. I had invested $5,000 from my military savings into a small cybersecurity firm run by former military intelligence officers. 6 months later, the company was acquired by a major defense contractor for 12 times its initial valuation. Suddenly, I had $60,000 and a growing understanding that my military experience provided advantages in investment circles that my family could never imagine. But instead of celebrating this success, I had hidden it. The pattern was too deeply ingrained. Sarah doesn't need attention. Sarah handles things quietly. Sarah doesn't make waves. I opened accounts with discreet investment firms, used shell companies to obscure my activities, and maintained the facade of someone getting by on a VA counselor's salary. The irony was that the very family dynamics that had trained me to be invisible were now preventing them from seeing my success. They had spent so many years treating me as the reliable but unremarkable sibling that they couldn't imagine me as anything else. When unexplained windfalls came their way, they attributed them to luck or coincidence rather than considering that someone in their inner circle might be orchestrating their good fortune. Marcus had been first, though he never knew it. 3 years ago, his consulting firm had been struggling to land a major contract with a regional healthcare system. The competition was fierce, and his proposal, while competent, wasn't particularly innovative. I had used my connections in the veteran business community to identify the healthcare system's real priorities, modernizing their mental health services for veteran employees, and anonymously provided Marcus with detailed research on veteran-specific healthcare needs. When his firm won the contract, he attributed it to his business acumen and market research skills. The success launched his company into a new tier of consulting work, leading to the financial stability that allowed him to buy the Tesla and the house in Bellevue. He never questioned how his market research had been so perfectly targeted, or why the healthcare system had been so impressed with his understanding of veteran issues, despite his never having served. Rachel's trajectory had been even more directly influenced by my hidden involvement. Her art was talented, but not commercially viable in Seattle's competitive gallery scene. I had quietly purchased several of her pieces through intermediaries, then donated them to corporate collections and medical facilities where they would be seen by potential buyers. The artificial demand created buzz around her work, leading to gallery representation and eventually her teaching position at the Community Art Center. She had no idea that the anonymous patron who had been supporting community arts programs was the same sister who showed up to family dinners in discount store clothing, driving a car with 150,000 miles on it. The cognitive dissonance never occurred to her because she, like the rest of the family, had accepted the narrative that I was the one who needed help, not the one providing it. Mom's situation had been the most complex to navigate. After Dad's diagnosis, their medical expenses had quickly outstripped their insurance coverage and savings. The house they had lived in for 25 years was at risk of foreclosure. But Mom's pride would never have allowed her to accept direct financial help from her children, especially not from the one she saw as struggling. The solution had required creating an entire fictional narrative. I had established a medical assistance foundation, complete with federal nonprofit status and a professional website, specifically designed to help families dealing with extended cancer treatment costs. The foundation's anonymous donor had provided exactly the assistance Mom needed, along with case management services that I had hired and monitored personally. Mom had been grateful to the foundation, but had never connected it to me. When she mentioned the help at family gatherings, praising the wonderful people who had saved their home, I had nodded along with appropriate sympathy while mentally reviewing the quarterly reports from the property management company I had hired to maintain their home systems. The foundation had grown beyond my family's needs, actually helping dozens of other families navigate similar crises. It had become one of my most fulfilling investments, though I could never take credit for it. The annual board meetings were conducted through video calls where I appeared as S. Harrison, a privacy-focused philanthropist who preferred to remain anonymous. Even the foundation's staff had never met me in person. Each success had reinforced the pattern. I provided help invisibly, they accepted it gratefully without recognizing the source, and our family dynamics remained undisturbed. They continued to see me as the solid but unremarkable sibling who had found her niche in public service, while I continued to orchestrate their stability from behind a carefully maintained curtain of modesty. The psychological complexity of the arrangement had only become clear to me recently. I wasn't just hiding my success to avoid attention. I was protecting myself from the possibility that even my wealth wouldn't change how they saw me. As long as they didn't know about my investments, I could tell myself that their treatment of me was based on incomplete information rather than fundamental indifference. But Dad's final conversation had suggested he had seen through the facade, at least partially. His question about why I lived like I was afraid of success had carried an undertone of understanding that I hadn't recognized at the time. Looking back now, I wondered if he had suspected more than he let on, if his carefully worded estate planning had been designed to force exactly the revelation that was now approaching. The lawyer meeting was no longer just about Dad's estate. It was about the collision between the life I had built and the life they thought I was living. James Morrison had handled enough of my business to understand exactly who Sarah Henderson was in Seattle's investment community. The question was whether he would maintain professional discretion or whether Dad's estate planning would make such discretion impossible. As I sat in my modest apartment, surrounded by the props of my assumed poverty, I realized that the 5-year performance was about to end. The only question remaining was whether the family who had spent half a decade pitying my limitations would be able to accept the reality of my capabilities. The weekend before the lawyer meeting brought a cascade of incidents that made the weight of my deception feel unbearable. It started Saturday morning when Rachel called, her voice bright with excitement about a miracle that had just transformed her financial situation. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," she said, practically bouncing through the phone. "Remember that piece I painted last year? The one with the Mount Rainier sunset that I couldn't sell because everyone said it was too large for most homes? I remembered it well. It was a stunning 6-foot canvas that had taken her 3 months to complete, but its size had made it commercially difficult. I also remembered purchasing it through a corporate art acquisition company for $15,000 and donating it to Seattle Children's Hospital, where it now hung in their main lobby. Well, Apparently, some big corporation bought it and donated it to the children's hospital, and now there's a whole article in the Seattle Times about local artists contributing to healthcare environments. 3 different galleries have called me this week wanting to discuss representation for large-scale corporate installations. Her joy was infectious, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel proud of the outcome. The article had been better than I'd hoped. It had positioned her work as socially conscious art that served community needs, opening doors I hadn't anticipated. That's amazing, Rachel. You deserve the recognition. I know, right? And the timing couldn't be better because I was starting to worry about how I'd contribute to Dad's expenses. Now I might actually be able to help in a meaningful way instead of... She paused, and I knew what was coming. Instead of being like you know? Wanting to help, but not having the resources to make a real difference. The words hit like a physical blow. She had no idea that her sudden career breakthrough was the direct result of my resources, but she was using it to distance herself from what she saw as my financial inadequacy. The irony was so sharp it took my breath away. I'm glad things are looking up for you, I managed. Thanks. And Sarah? Don't feel bad about only being able to contribute $500. We know you're doing your best with what you have. After she hung up, I sat staring at my phone, feeling something shift inside my chest. The condescension in her voice when she said, "what you have," carried an assumption that was becoming harder to bear. She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely believed she was being understanding and supportive, which somehow made it worse. Sunday brought Marcus to my door, unexpected and carrying coffee from the expensive roastery near his office. He knocked with the particular rhythm he'd used since childhood, a little tune that was supposed to be charming but had always felt presumptuous to me. "Hey, sister," he said when I opened the door, holding up the coffee cup like a peace offering. "Thought you might need some decent caffeine before the big lawyer meeting tomorrow." I accepted the coffee, noting that he'd remembered my preference for dark roast with no additives. Such small gestures of thoughtfulness had always made his casual dismissals more painful. "Thanks. Come in." He settled onto my second-hand couch, looking around the apartment with eyes that cataloged everything as evidence of my limited circumstances. His gaze lingered on my outdated laptop, my small television, the stack of library books that suggested I couldn't afford to buy what I wanted to read. "So, I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow," he said, his tone shifting to what I had learned to recognize as his handling Sarah voice. "I know family meetings about money can be stressful, especially when you're not in a position to contribute much." I sipped the coffee, excellent quality, probably $12 a pound, and waited for him to continue. "The thing is, Morrison mentioned that Dad's estate is more complicated than we initially thought. There might be some trust issues, some investment accounts we weren't aware of. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by financial discussions that aren't really relevant to your situation." Financial discussions that weren't relevant to my situation. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Marcus had no way of knowing that I probably understood estate planning and investment structures better than he did, that I had been managing complex financial arrangements for years while he was still calling Dad for advice about his business accounting. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "Just that if things get technical, don't feel like you need to follow every detail. Rachel and I can handle the complicated stuff and give you a summary afterward. Sometimes these legal meetings can be pretty dry, and I know numbers aren't really your thing." Numbers aren't really your thing. The assumption was based on nothing more than my choice to work in counseling rather than finance, but he stated it with such confidence that I wondered if I had somehow given him reason to believe it. Had I been so convincing in my performance of financial simplicity that I had created a character who was actually financially illiterate? "I think I can follow along," I said carefully. He smiled, the kind of indulgent expression you give a child who insists they can handle adult responsibilities. "Of course. I just want you to know there's no pressure. We're family. We look out for each other." After he left, I found myself standing in my kitchen, looking at the coffee cup that had probably cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week. The gesture was kind, but it was kindness rooted in pity. He had bought me premium coffee because he assumed I couldn't afford it myself, the same way someone might bring flowers to a hospital patient or soup to a neighbor with the flu. The pattern had become so entrenched that they no longer questioned it. I was the family member who needed small kindnesses, who required gentle handling, who should be protected from complicated discussions about money. They had constructed an entire framework for interacting with me that was based on their assumptions about my limitations. Monday morning brought the final piece of evidence I needed to understand how deeply their perceptions had calcified. I was getting ready for the lawyer meeting when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Honey, I packed some sandwiches for after the meeting. I know these legal things can take a while, and I didn't want you to have to worry about buying lunch somewhere expensive downtown." The text was accompanied by a photo of a brown paper bag with my name written on it in her careful handwriting. Inside, I could see what looked like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, the kind she used to pack for school field trips when money was tight during my childhood. The gesture nearly broke me. She had remembered that I might get hungry during a long meeting and had taken time to prepare food for me because she assumed I would be stressed about the cost of downtown dining. It was maternal care filtered through the lens of economic assumptions that had become family fact. I sat on my bed, still in my bathrobe, and felt the weight of 5 years of accumulated misunderstandings. Every kindness they had shown me, every gentle accommodation, every careful consideration of my limitations had been building toward this moment. They had created an elaborate support system for someone who didn't exist, the struggling veteran sister who needed their protection and understanding. The real tragedy wasn't that they underestimated my capabilities. It was that their underestimation had become an act of love. They genuinely cared about me, but they cared about a version of me that was fundamentally fiction. Their concern was real, their support was genuine, but it was all directed toward someone I had never actually been. I got dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing clothes that would fit their expectations while privately acknowledging that this might be the last time I would need to consider their expectations when getting dressed. A simple gray blazer from Target, black pants that were professional but clearly not expensive, low-heeled shoes that were comfortable rather than stylish. As I drove downtown in my Honda, passing Marcus's Tesla in the law firm's parking garage, I thought about the different ways we had all learned to navigate the world. Marcus had learned to be charming, to present confidence even when he felt uncertain. Rachel had learned to be artistic, to frame her struggles as romantic rather than desperate. I had learned to be useful, to solve problems quietly, to never ask for anything in return. But somewhere along the way, useful had become invisible, and invisible had become forgettable, and forgettable had become pitiable. The very skills that had made me successful in business, the ability to work behind the scenes, to avoid attention, to let others take credit, had convinced my family that I was incapable of success. The elevator to Morrison's office felt like a time machine carrying me toward a collision between past and present. In less than an hour, James Morrison would open Dad's estate file, and the careful separation between my two lives would collapse. The family who had spent 5 years managing their concern for my financial struggles would discover that I had been managing their financial stability all along. I thought about Dad's final words to me, his question about why I lived like I was afraid of success. Maybe he had seen what I was only now beginning to understand, that I hadn't been protecting myself from their judgment of my success. I had been protecting myself from the possibility that even success wouldn't change how they saw me. As long as they didn't know about my wealth, their treatment of me could be attributed to incomplete information rather than fundamental indifference. But in a few minutes, all the information would be complete, and I would finally learn whether their love for me was conditional on my need for their care, or whether it was strong enough to survive the revelation that I had never needed their care at all. I sat in my Honda in the law firm's parking garage for 10 minutes after turning off the engine, watching Marcus and Rachel enter the building through the glass lobby doors. They walked with the confident stride of people who knew their place in the world. Marcus checking his phone while Rachel adjusted her colorful scarf, the one I had anonymously commissioned from a local artist and arranged to have delivered as a gallery opening gift last spring. The weight of the brown paper bag Mom had packed sat heavy on the passenger seat beside me. Inside were not just sandwiches, but the physical manifestation of 5 years of careful deception. Every assumption they had made about my limitations, every gentle accommodation they had offered, every moment of well-meaning condescension had led to this paper bag filled with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, because they couldn't imagine me affording lunch downtown. Something crystallized in that moment, sitting in the shadows of the parking garage while Seattle's autumn light filtered through concrete pillars. This wasn't just about revealing my financial success. It was about choosing who I wanted to be going forward. For 5 years, I had been Sarah Henderson, the struggling veteran who needed their understanding. In the next hour, I could become Sarah Henderson, the successful investor who had been secretly managing their lives. Or I could become someone else entirely, someone who was tired of being defined by other people's assumptions, regardless of whether those assumptions involved poverty or wealth. I pulled out my secure phone and scrolled through my recent messages. Elena Rodriguez had sent me 3 investment opportunities that morning, each one representing more money than my family thought I made in a year. A text from my property manager informed me that the Seattle building housing Marcus's office had a potential buyer interested in purchasing it for development, a decision that rested entirely with me as the anonymous owner. My accountant had forwarded tax documents showing that my charitable foundation had distributed over $2 million to families like ours in the past year alone. Each message was a reminder of the life I had built in the shadows, the decisions I made daily that affected dozens of people who had no idea I existed. I wasn't just wealthy. I was influential, connected, capable of changing lives with a phone call or a signature. Yet I was about to walk into that law office carrying sandwiches my mother had packed because she was worried about my lunch budget. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical force, and for the first time in months, I laughed. Not the polite chuckle I offered during family gatherings, but a real laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the parking garage. Here I was, a woman who could buy the building we were sitting in, worrying about whether my family would still love me if they discovered I didn't need their protection. I opened my text messages and began typing a message to Elena Rodriguez. Accept the Aurora Tech acquisition offer. Move forward with the Portland real estate development. Schedule a meeting for Thursday to discuss expanding the medical assistance foundation. I paused, then added, also, prepare a comprehensive report on all investments connected to my family members. It's time for some transparency. Sending that message felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for 5 years. Not because I was ready to reveal everything to my family, but because I was ready to stop making decisions based on their assumptions about who I was supposed to be. I got out of the car and walked toward the building, leaving Mom's carefully packed lunch on the passenger seat. As I crossed the lobby, I caught my reflection in the polished elevator doors. A 42-year-old woman in discount clothes, carrying a worn purse, looking every inch the part of someone who needed other people's financial considerations, but behind that reflection was someone else entirely. Someone who had spent years learning that the most powerful position was often the least visible one. The elevator carried me up to the 15th floor, where Morrison and Associates occupied, a corner suite with views of Elliott Bay. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, directed me to Conference Room B, where my family was already gathered around a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. Marcus had positioned himself at what he clearly considered the head of the table, his leather portfolio open and his phone face down, in a gesture that suggested serious business. Rachel sat to his right, her artistic sensibilities evident in the way she had arranged her coat and bag to create a visually pleasing composition. Mom occupied the chair closest to the door, her posture suggesting she was ready to flee if the legal discussion became too overwhelming. They looked up when I entered, and I saw their expressions shift through a familiar sequence. Initial pleasure at seeing me, followed by quick assessment of my appearance, concluding with the slight relaxation that came from confirming I looked exactly as they expected. Safe, manageable, requiring their protection. "Sarah, honey," Mom said, half rising from her chair. "Did you find parking okay? I know downtown can be expensive." "It was fine," I said, taking the remaining chair across from Marcus. The seating arrangement felt symbolic, them on one side of the table, me on the other, with Dad's empty chair at the actual head of the table waiting for James Morrison to fill it. Marcus glanced at his watch, a gesture I recognized as his way of demonstrating that he was the kind of person who tracked time efficiently. "Morrison should be here any minute. I talked to him briefly yesterday and he mentioned there are some documents that need explanation. Nothing we can't handle, but it might take longer than we originally thought." Rachel nodded, then looked at me with concern. "Are you okay being here all afternoon? I know you probably had to take time off work, and I don't want this to affect your job security." My job security. They were worried that attending a family meeting might jeopardize my position at the VA, as if I were one absence away from termination, rather than someone who had accumulated months of unused vacation time because I rarely needed to take days off for personal business. "I'll be fine," I said. The door opened, and James Morrison entered with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that whispered rather than shouted its expense, he moved with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years managing other people's most sensitive business. His eyes found mine immediately, and I saw a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity about how this meeting would unfold. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, settling into Dad's chair with a thick folder that seemed to contain more documents than a simple estate would. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time, and I appreciate your patience as we work through your father's final wishes." He opened the folder, revealing documents that I could see were far more complex than basic will and testament. Paperwork. Asset lists, corporate filings, trust documents, investment statements. The kind of comprehensive estate planning that suggested Dad's financial situation had been more sophisticated than any of us had understood. Marcus leaned forward, his business instincts engaging. We weren't aware that Dad had such extensive documentation. His finances always seemed pretty straightforward. Morrison smiled in a way that suggested he had been anticipating this reaction. "Your father was more private about his financial affairs than most people realized. He spent considerable time over the past 2 years working with various advisors to structure his estate in a way that would provide maximum benefit to his family while honoring certain principles that were important to him." He pulled out a document that I recognized as a trust agreement, though it was more complex than anything I had expected Dad to establish. Morrison's eyes moved around the table, lingering on each of us, before settling on me with an expression that made my pulse quicken. "Before we begin with the specific bequests," he said carefully, "your father wanted me to address what he called the elephant in the room. He believed that there were certain family dynamics that needed to be acknowledged before his final wishes could be properly understood." The silence that followed was charged with tension I didn't fully understand. Marcus and Rachel exchanged glances, while Mom shifted nervously in her chair. I found myself holding my breath, suddenly certain that the careful walls between my 2 lives were about to collapse in ways I hadn't anticipated. Morrison looked directly at me. "Sarah, your father was aware that you have been less than fully transparent about your financial circumstances." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my family's attention snap toward me with sudden intensity, their expressions shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. The comfortable narrative they had constructed about their struggling veteran sister was suddenly under attack, though they didn't yet understand how or why. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, though my voice carried less conviction than I intended. Morrison opened another section of his folder, revealing documents that made my blood run cold. Bank statements with my name on them, corporate filings, listing me as a principal, investment reports showing returns that dwarfed anything my family could have imagined. He didn't display them fully, but he placed them on the table in a way that made it clear he possessed comprehensive information. About my financial life? "Your father hired a private investigator 18 months ago," Morrison said gently. "Not to spy on you, but to understand why his most capable child was living like his least successful one. He wanted to ensure that his estate planning took into account the full picture of his family's actual circumstances." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. I could see Marcus and Rachel processing the implications, their faces cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something. That might have been betrayal. Mom's hand went to her throat in a gesture of shock that seemed genuinely unconscious. But what struck me most was the absence of surprise in my own reaction. Some part of me had been waiting for this moment for 5 years, had perhaps been orchestrating it without conscious awareness. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming, not because my secret was revealed, but because the exhausting performance of being someone I wasn't was finally ending. Morrison continued, his voice professional but not unkind. "Your father's final wishes were structured around what he learned about each of his children's true circumstances. He wanted his legacy to reflect reality, rather than the stories you had all chosen to tell yourselves about each other." I looked across the table at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. They weren't cruel people or deliberately dismissive. They were simply people who had become comfortable with a narrative that made sense of their world, and that narrative was now crumbling around them. The decision crystallized in that moment. I could continue trying to manage their perceptions, could find ways to minimize or explain away what Morrison was revealing, or I could finally stop performing and allow them to meet the person I had actually become. "It's true," I said quietly. "I haven't been honest about my financial situation." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally learning to fly. The silence that followed my admission stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Marcus was the first to break it, his voice carrying a strange mix of confusion and something that might have been accusation. "What do you mean you haven't been honest?" "Sarah, we've been worried about you for years. We've been trying to help you, trying to make sure you're okay financially." I looked at him across the mahogany table, this brother who had spent 5 years seeing me as a cautionary tale, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary clarity that comes when you finally stop carrying a weight you never should have picked up. "I know you have," I said, "and I appreciate that you cared enough to worry, but the help wasn't necessary." Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps it would be helpful if I explained what your father discovered and how it influenced his estate planning." He pulled out a document that I recognized as a summary of my investment portfolio, though it was dated 6 months ago and showed numbers that were actually conservative compared to my current position. Even so, the figures on the page represented more wealth than my family had ever imagined I could possess. Rachel leaned forward, squinting at the document as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "This says, Sarah, this says you have over $40 million in investment accounts." 47.3 as of last week, I said quietly. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Mom made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a whimper. Marcus stared at me as if I had suddenly sprouted additional limbs. Rachel's artist's eye, trained to see details others missed, was scanning my appearance with new intensity, probably wondering how someone with that much money could look so thoroughly ordinary. I don't understand, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, honey, if you have that kind of money, why are you living in that tiny apartment? Why are you driving that old car? Why do you work at the VA for $35,000 a year? The questions came from a place of genuine bewilderment, and I realized that my family's inability to understand my choices was perhaps more revealing than my deception had been. They couldn't fathom having wealth and choosing not to display. It couldn't imagine success that didn't come with visible markers of achievement. Because I like my work, I said. Because I like my apartment. Because a car is just transportation, and my Honda gets me where I need to go. I paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. And because I learned a long time ago that being invisible often means being powerful. Morrison nodded approvingly, then pulled out another set of documents. Your father understood Sarah's approach better than you might think. In fact, he structured his estate to reflect what he called invisible contributions that had been made to the family over the past several years. He spread out a series of financial records that I recognized with growing alarm. Bank transfers, corporate filings, charitable donations, a paper trail that connected me to every mysterious windfall, every convenient coincidence, every stroke of luck that had smoothed my family's path over the past 5 years. Marcus's face went pale as he recognized his office building's purchase documents with my shell company listed as the buyer. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth when she saw records of art purchases that corresponded exactly to her career breakthrough. Mom stared at documentation of the Medical Assistance Foundation that had saved their house, my name listed as the founding benefactor. You, Marcus said, his voice hollow with shock. You've been... All of it was you. Most of it, I confirmed. Not all your successes, you're both talented and capable. But when you needed a safety net, when opportunities needed to be created, when disasters needed to be averted, yes, that was me. Rachel was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the revelation. The gallery showing that launched my career, the corporate art sales that gave me credibility, the anonymous patron who's been supporting, the community arts program. That was all you? I nodded, watching as 5 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled around them. They were learning that the sister they had pitied, the family member they had treated with gentle condescension, had actually been the architect of their stability all along. Morrison continued his methodical revelation of Dad's estate plan, which was far more complex than a simple inheritance distribution. Dad had apparently spent his final months working with financial advisors to create a structure that would acknowledge the truth of our family dynamics while addressing what he saw as fundamental imbalances in how we related to each other. Your father was particularly concerned about what he called the cost of invisibility, Morrison explained. He recognized that Sarah had been supporting the family financially while receiving none of the recognition or gratitude that such support typically generates. His estate plan is designed to address that imbalance. The documents Morrison produced showed that Dad had restructured his assets to create a family trust with me as the primary trustee, responsible for managing distributions to Marcus and Rachel, according to guidelines that prioritized need over want and contribution over consumption. It was a role that would require me to step out of the shadows, to make decisions openly rather than anonymously, to take credit for support rather than hiding behind elaborate deceptions. But the most significant revelation came in the form of a letter Dad had written to be read at this meeting. Morrison handed it to me, explaining that Dad had specifically requested I read it aloud to the family. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the familiar handwriting. Dad's voice seemed to echo in the words as I read them. Sarah, by the time Sue. You read this, your family will finally understand what I learned too late. That you have been the foundation holding us all up while we worried about whether you were strong enough to stand on your own. I failed you by not seeing sooner how our assumptions about your limitations had become a prison that you built to protect yourself from our judgment. Marcus and Rachel, you are both good people who love your sister, but you learned to love a version of her that never truly existed. The real Sarah, the one who built a fortune through intelligence and discipline, who used that fortune to ensure your success while asking for nothing in return, deserves better than your pity. She deserves your respect, your recognition, and your gratitude. Helen, my dear wife, you raised our daughter to be strong and self-sufficient, but somewhere along the way we forgot to celebrate those qualities. We taught her to be useful rather than valued, and she learned the lesson so well that she made herself invisible even to us. I am structuring my estate to force this conversation because I believe this family's greatest asset is not money, but honesty. Sarah has been honest about everything except her success. The rest of you have been honest about everything except your dependence on that success. It's time for all of us to live in the truth. The silence that followed the letter was different from the earlier shock. Heavier, more contemplative. I could see my family processing not just the revelation of my wealth, but the implications of what Dad had written. They were being forced to confront their own assumptions, their own blind spots, their own complicity in a dynamic that had diminished all of us. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice subdued. Sarah, I don't know what to say. I thought I was being supportive, but I was actually being patronizing. I thought you needed our help, but you were the one helping us all along. Rachel nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. I feel like such a fool. All those times I worried about you, all those gentle suggestions about your career, your living situation, and you were secretly managing our entire family's financial stability. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I'm proud of you, she said simply. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm ashamed that I never saw it. But mostly, I'm sorry that you felt like you had to hide your success from the people who should have been celebrating it. The meeting continued for another hour as Morrison explained the technical details of Dad's estate plan, but the real business had been concluded with that moment of recognition. My family finally saw me, not as the struggling veteran who needed their protection, but as the capable woman who had been protecting them. As we gathered our things to leave, Marcus approached me with an expression I had never seen before. Something between respect and curiosity, as if he were meeting me for the first time. Can I ask you something? He said. Why did you hide it? Why go through all the elaborate deceptions instead of just telling us the truth? I considered the question, one I had been asking myself for months. Because I was afraid, I said finally. Afraid that even if you knew I was successful, you still wouldn't see me as equal. At least when you thought I was struggling, I could tell myself that your treatment of me was based on incomplete information rather than fundamental indifference. He nodded slowly, processing this. And now? Now I guess we'll find out, I said. Now we'll see if this family can learn to relate to each other based on who we actually are, rather than who we assumed we were. As I walked back to my Honda in the parking garage, I felt lighter than I had in years. The performance was over, the masks were off, and whatever came next would at least be honest. I had stopped pretending to be powerless, and they had stopped pretending I was pitiable. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, the one I kept because I genuinely liked it, not because I couldn't afford better, and began making calls. To Elena Rodriguez, to discuss restructuring my investment approach now that discretion was no longer necessary. To my property manager, to begin operating more transparently. To the board of my Medical Assistance Foundation, to discuss expanding our work now that I could be publicly associated with it. The most important call was to my family group chat, where I sent a simple message. Tomorrow, let's have dinner at my place. I'll cook, and we can start getting to know each other for real. For the first time in 5 years, I signed the message with my full name. Sarah Henderson, veteran counselor, investor, and no longer invisible. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or misunderstood by the people closest to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about breaking free from other people's limitations and discovering your own power, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply stop pretending to be smaller than you are.